Welcome back to the Vitera vlogs. This is part 11 and the final one for the series covering my team's progression in the new server Vitera. This video will cover from level 640 to 730, which took us about 5 months. On the previous episode, we had started to 5 men and mostly on Rotten Wasteland, and this video takes place right after the Winter Update 2023, which introduced some new spawns, in particular the War Dragons, so we started working on the quest and tried out the spawn right away. As a 5-man, our initial raw experience was sitting over the 5kks, which was disappointing at first, but then the next day, as a 4-man and with a better idea for a lab to use, we got experience up to 6.5kk. So at the very least, that was more promising for team hunts. And for my duo hunts, this update also introduced a new option, the Vulture Lair. This one was quite a change of pace for my usual duo hunts, but it was pretty decent, with an experience of around the 4.5kk and profit close to the 900k per person. So that became my main duo spawn. With the team, we did go back to Rotten one more time to finish up the Branchy Crawler bestiary, but besides that, we didn't want to stay there and instead focus mostly on dragons, which by now, with some charms and during our 5-man hunts, it was giving us close to the 6.5kk raw, and during 4-mans, it will go up to around the 7kk. So with no better alternative at the time, but also enjoying the new content, we stayed on dragons for quite a while. During the first months, since the first hunt at dragons, starting at level 640, I went up to 668, missing about 10 days, due to the new year and normal weekends. We also didn't do many 5-man hunts anymore as the second druid found a more stable team to fill in, so all things considered, things didn't change all that much. Our raw experience as a 4-man was between the 7 to 7.5kk and my duo hunts on Vultures were around the 5kk. By the second month of the update, the demand for dragons was high, and we started to struggle finding it available during the time we normally play. So to change things up, we decided to try out team hunting in Vultures. In these hunts, we were doing about 6kk raw, with no charms, and then up to 6.2kk with charms. So not quite good enough to stay there, but it was fine for a few days to get some easy charm points. Not saying the spawn is easy, but the amount of kills per hour is so high that in less than 5 hours you get 150 points. After that, we went back to dragons, and instead our backup plan, if it was taken, was to hunt on the second floor. This one is not as good and is much harder to hunt, but it's still doable. Unfortunately, I don't have video recordings of these hunts, so I probably won't be making a guide for it, unless there is some interest on that. So let me know in the comments, but honestly, it was at least over 15% less raw experience to hunting on -1, so it's only viable when your team is holding praise on dragons. Anyways, during this second month, I went from 665 to 685, with 2 deaths in between and around 20 days of playing. My second death happened while clearing down the access to the crater boss. If you've seen the previous episodes of the series, I said that we had been farming the boss of the Rotten Wasteland, and now we had replaced that boss with Furious Crater instead, since the access is technically easier and faster. So the idea was to save time, and the boss itself is perfectly doable by a team of 600s with not much difficulty. Additionally, something to point out is that during some hunts in dragons, we will have a higher level fill-in for somebody else, and with that, the experience of dragons will go over the 8kk, and with other things I fill in myself, it will be over the 9kk. With that in mind, we continue to hunt on dragons, but we couldn't replicate those numbers with our levels, and eventually we couldn't even get the spawn anymore, and decided to go back to Fire Library. But despite having 100 levels higher than our last hunt, it didn't get any easier, and then this happened. We finally gave up on our druid.
What the fuck? Oh, fuck.
Some magic go
damn
to
it.
your northwest if you are supposed to.
That's where I'm supposed to go? I'm
need to
gonna have to
Need to leave
help
this.
him get out somehow. Yeah, just walk this out.
Rugas.
Oh,
Not a good spot.
good.
You reached him.
This clip doesn't say much, but basically, I have hinted in multiple episodes of the series that we couldn't communicate with a druid. He didn't understand English, and even though we both spoke Spanish, he didn't make any effort to try to communicate with me either. Through the many months of playing together, he simply wouldn't join Discord, and on top of that, he just wasn't a good player for this level range or higher. And the Fire Library hunts in particular will highlight that so clearly to us multiple times. So with that, we made the decision to let him go and brought in Charlie from our previous 5-man hunts to join us permanently as the main druid. With him, all of our hunts improved right away. The Fire Library hunts went up to around the 7.6kk raw, our Dragon hunts to over 8kk, and even our Isabi hunts was sitting around the 8kk as well. And by the end of February, I finished at level 703 with around 15 days of playtime, since we did have a long break in between the replacement of the druid, with most of our hunts taking place between Isabi or Fighter Library, since Dragons was still highly contested. And then during March, we finally went to a different spawn, this time the Energy Library. The team wasn't very excited about this, since like Isabi, both RP and MS had hunted this spawn so long, especially my MS spent close to a year only hunting Energy Library back in the day, but we had to do something different and we decided on this, which honestly went pretty good. The experience will be over the 7.5kk in average, so similar results to Fire Library, but a bit more profit and less difficult in my opinion. With that, for most of March, we remained in Energy Library, going from level 703 to 725, with about 18 days of playtime, with 1 death and 1 gift of life proc. Then, now that we had a bit more levels and a new druid, we decided to try in gold -3 again, making around the 7.4 to 7.8kk raw and decent profit. It was still a bit difficult but more manageable this time, and then as I revealed in the beginning of the video, my endpoint for this character was level 730. I might go in more detail in a different video, but the decision came from 2 main points. One, the game was getting stale. For a long time now, our experience was barely reaching the 8kk raw, but technically we were stuck in the 7 to 8kk range for the longest time, despite changing spawns multiple times. That was our peak with the strength of our characters, which by being on a close and new server, it wasn't limited to just skills, but also equipment upgrades. So we were too weak to hunt the spawns properly, and also too weak to make the experience needed to progress. With that, the hunts were not enjoyable, as we had to really push hard to make decent experience. Then the second point is that every new server has an expiry date. This happens once the server opens up for transfers, and then your character loses half its value instantly, since now you will have a character weaker to the rest of the world, but also even your position in the high scores won't have any meaning. So in order to avoid that, it's best to sell the character while it is still desirable in a closed server, and then upgrade to a better character for similar cost, or slightly higher in price, which is what we did. But curiously, all of our characters sold, and none of them were kept in Vitera. They were all transferred to different servers, possibly with the main goal of servicing them for a Rotten Blood quest and resell them after. So what we thought were valuable characters for being in the top 20 of a closed server meant nothing. Nowadays, the quests available give the value to the characters, be it a Soul War, Primal, or Rotten Blood. All of them have different minimum values assigned to the character, and that's something to be aware of if you are playing a new server. Additionally, even though we expected the servers to open up for transfers, it has been nearly 4 months since then, and Vitera remains closed, even despite a new wave of merged servers getting announced. So that will conclude the Vitera vlogs. I don't have plans on making a separate series of our progression with our new characters, as I feel it doesn't hold the same sentiment anymore, since we all jumped quite a bit of levels in the upgrade, with me gaining 117 levels, Charlie gaining 238, Moan gaining almost 300 levels, and Nodlock gaining 500 levels, although he was the only one that didn't buy a character. Instead went back to playing his original sorcerer, the party animal, which was the most impactful and deciding factor for the move. Since he didn't need to buy a character, he decided to help us cover some of the cost of the upgrade instead, plus himself upgrading in strengths by so much will make the hunts a lot better in general, and since May, that's where we've been. Our current server is Smera. We're still playing together but with different characters. We still don't play on weekends, but for the most part, we've been a lot more consistent with playing, and have done a lot of the same spawns, but also some new content as well. That's all I got for this. Thank you very much for enjoying this series covering our progression in a new server. It was never meant to be a guide on how to get levels faster, because we clearly didn't do a good job at that, but instead to showcase how starting fresh can be enjoyable and also not at the same time. You can play Tibia however you feel like, ideally with a team that shares the same goals or approach to the game, and not be focused on just grinding one spawn, but rather try it out as much as you can. Thank you for watching, and a special thanks to the Guild Causality, Nightstar, and Tuna Hero for supporting the channel.